On an ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's cozy home, as the sun had set behind the horizon, the twilight deepened and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. Inside the house, everything was peaceful. Mummy Pig was putting away things in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper in the living room. In the children's bedroom, Peppa and her younger brother George were getting ready for bed. They were laughing, sharing toys, and everything felt just like any other night. But their peace was interrupted by a strange sound. From under the wooden floor of their bedroom came a scratching noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of mice or the creak of old boards. The sounds were rhythmic, as if something was scratching the wood with long claws, pausing and then repeating. Peppa and George froze. Their little hearts were beating faster, in sync with the eerie scraping sound. "Did you hear that?" whispered Peppa. George nodded, clutching his pillow tighter. They tried to stay still, listening for any other noises. The scratching faded, then returned, growing closer each time. It felt as if some invisible creature was slowly moving beneath their bedroom. Night had fully descended when Peppa suddenly woke up. The room was filled with absolute, dead silence, which was far more terrifying than any sound. Then she heard it. Muffled, heavy footsteps, as if something huge and invisible was walking directly under them. Each step echoed like a dull thud. After that, a low knock followed, then a deep, intermittent breathing, filling the room with icy air. Peppa cautiously shook George. He sleepily opened his eyes but immediately widened them when he heard a new sound, the slow creak of wood. One of the old floorboards slowly lifted. Peppa held her breath. Two long, unnaturally thin limbs, black as charred wood, emerged from beneath it. They looked like twisted branches of an ancient tree but moved too consciously and deliberately. The deer monster's hands slowly groped the surface of the floor, every motion graceful, almost elegant. The children watched in terror as the fingers slid across the wood, as though searching for a gap to grasp and crawl out. George squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the blanket. Peppa, trembling, couldn't tear her eyes away. It seemed as though the black fingers lingered by her bed, as if sensing her breath. In an instant, the hands disappeared as quietly as they had appeared. The board lowered back into place, and the room sank into silence again. But on the floor remained dark, sticky marks like traces of resin. "Mummy!" George exhaled, his voice so faint that Peppa barely heard him. They didn't dare call for their parents. It felt like making even the slightest sound would bring the hands back. Peppa and George sat together, holding each other tightly, waiting. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house made them flinch. Just before dawn, when the first light filtered through the curtains, Peppa dared to get out of bed. Where the hands had moved during the night, the floorboard was damp and cold. Faint, dark prints were visible, thin lines like patterns of branches leading deeper into the crack. Peppa looked up and noticed a new crack in the wall. It stretched upwards, as if the tree was trying to break into the room. George approached her, and they froze. From the crack came a faint, barely audible whisper. The deer monster had returned to the darkness of the crawl space, but it had not left. It was waiting. Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all. but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone. It had been drizzling all day. At first it was quiet, barely noticeable, but by evening the rain grew heavy and relentless. Drops drummed on the roof, the windows trembled with a fine shiver. The sky was fully overcast, and the forest beyond the house seemed like an endless wall of darkness. The wind wandered through the branches, and from time to time came a creak, as if something enormous was moving through the thicket. Peppa and George sat in the living room. They tried to play with building blocks, but the tower collapsed again and again, sometimes from their clumsiness, sometimes from the pounding rain that shook the whole house. Their parents were gone. Mummy and Daddy Pig had gone to town and left dinner for the children. The house seemed cozy, but the longer the rain lasted, the more it felt as though something alien was hiding outside the windows. When the first howl came, George flinched and dropped a block. It was a long, drawn-out sound, unlike anything they had ever heard. Not wind, not an animal, something else entirely. It slid under the skin and echoed in the bones. Peppa stood up and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, she saw two enormous red lights. They glowed motionless, but so brightly that their cold radiance pierced through the rain. Peppa realized they were eyes staring straight at their house. "What is that?" George whispered, pressing against his sister. At that very moment, there was a knock at the door, slow and heavy, as if struck by a hoof. The knock came again, louder, and was joined by a dreadful scratching, sharp claws raking the wood. "Don't open it!" George pleaded, but curiosity won. Peppa's trembling hands opened the door just a crack. On the threshold stood the deer monster. His antlers stretched high, sharp as blades. His eyes burned with sinister light, and dark liquid dripped from his jaws. The creature stepped inside. Its hooves left black marks on the floor, smoke rising from each print. With every movement, the house grew colder, the lamps overhead dimmer. "You cannot leave," it rasped, voice like rusted metal scraping stone. "Now you belong to the forest." The children rushed to the windows, but they slammed shut on their own. The door behind the monster crashed closed. The house seemed alive, no longer willing to let them out. The floor quaked, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The monster's antlers began to grow, splitting the beams above. Shadows in the corners stretched into shapes like long, reaching arms. Peppa grabbed George and pulled him toward the stairs. For a moment, it seemed safer upstairs, but the monster's steps thundered after them, each one shaking the walls. On the second floor, the windows no longer showed their yard. Through the glass stood tree trunks, as though the house had been carried deep into the forest. The wind howled in the corridors, and on the walls seeped patterns of moss and pine needles. Peppa and George hid in their room, but the door swung open on its own. The monster entered, its eyes lighting the walls and turning shadows into writhing beasts. "Now, the house is part of the forest," it hissed. Its antlers pierced through the ceiling, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of water, as if the rain had spilled indoors. The children screamed, but their voices drowned in the roar of the storm. Everything grew darker, colder. The room dissolved, walls fading away, replaced by the rising trunks of trees. The night dragged on endlessly. Peppa and George no longer knew where their home was. In the village, or already swallowed by the woods, they clung to each other as the monster's steps and breathing echoed around them. When morning came and their parents returned, the door opened without resistance. The house was quiet. Toys lay scattered on the floor, the lights were on, but the children were gone. Only two small pairs of shoes stood neatly by the threshold. But the house was strange. The hallway smelled of resin, damp stains spread across the walls, and pine cones lay in the corner. Mummy and Daddy Pig exchanged a glance but said nothing. Since then, children's voices are sometimes heard in the forest at night. They call for help, call for home, but the path always leads deeper into the thicket, and among the trees still roams the deer monster. Sometimes in the windows of the empty house his eyes can be seen, red, unblinking, just like that night when Peppa and George opened the door. It all began with a small scratch on George's arm. He hurt himself while playing in the yard, and no one paid much attention. Mummy cleaned the wound. Daddy said it would heal by morning. But by the next morning, nothing had changed. More than that, Peppa noticed George had become different. He didn't laugh, didn't ask to play dinosaurs, didn't run after her in the garden. Instead, he sat by the window, staring off into the distance. His little fingers twisted a toy absent-mindedly, but his eyes, they were empty, as if he wasn't looking outside at all, but falling inward into endless darkness. "George," Peppa called softly. He turned his head slowly and a smile flickered on his lips. But it wasn't her brother's smile. There was no warmth, no joy in it. It was something foreign. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. With each passing day, George grew quieter. He ate less and less, even refused his favorite ice cream. His skin paled, shadows deepened under his eyes. And one evening, Peppa caught a strange smell. It came from George, damp earth, mold, as if he had spent hours lying in some wet basement. She tried to tell their parents. "Something's wrong with George, he's scaring me." But Mummy only stroked her head. "Don't make things up, darling. George is just tired." Peppa knew. It wasn't tiredness. That night, a faint sound woke her. A soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Peppa slowly sat up in bed and saw George. He was standing in the darkness in the middle of the room, motionless. Moonlight fell across his face and his eyes reflected it so that they looked completely white. "George?" Peppa whispered. He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly and smiled again. The next few days were a nightmare for her. She was afraid to be alone with him. His presence made the air cold, as if he carried dampness into the house. Sometimes Peppa thought he had stopped breathing altogether. He sat still like a doll, and only minutes later would he take one long, heavy breath. And then, one night, what she feared most happened. A dull thud woke her. Peppa opened her eyes and saw George. He was lying on the floor, his body twisting as if something inside was breaking him apart. Two dark bulges pushed through his back with a sickening crack. They grew, tore through, and within moments became wings. Enormous, leathery, black. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. George lifted his head. His hands were no longer hands. Long claws scraped against the floor. From his mouth came an inhuman cry. "I'm not George anymore!" A violent gust of wind shattered the window. With one beat of his new wings, George shot upward. Glass rained down. Wind roared into the room. Peppa shielded her face. When she dared to look again, her brother was gone. On the floor lay his toy dinosaur, smeared with black slime that spread slowly across the boards. Peppa collapsed onto the bed and wept. She didn't know where to run, what to do. Her parents, it seemed, hadn't even stirred from the noise. The next morning, no one spoke of George. His chair at the table was empty, but Mummy and Daddy acted as if it had always been so. "Where's George?" Peppa asked desperately. Mummy looked at her calmly. "We've only ever had you, Peppa." Those words struck harder than the nightmare itself. She realized George wasn't just gone physically. His very memory was being erased. But Peppa remembered. A few nights later, a knock woke her. Soft, deliberate, against the window. She slowly opened her eyes and saw him. George, but not him. His face was elongated. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Wings stretched behind him, blocking out the moonlight. His mouth opened, and from it came a whisper. "You're next, Peppa." She tried to scream, but her throat closed and no sound escaped. And then she saw Labubu. He was sitting on the windowsill. His eyes burned red. His smile was wider than ever. The toy shook his head slowly, as if saying, "I can't help you." Peppa pressed her hooves to her face, her heart pounding wildly. She knew then, George was only the beginning. Labubu was not there to protect her. He was part of this nightmare, and now he was waiting. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him, "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices. Even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if 2 more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all, but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalero Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larila. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalero Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirala's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next.